Something unexpected happens at the later stages of psychological growth. It does not feel like progress. It does not feel like improvement. It does not even feel like change. It feels like recognition. And that realization can be deeply disorienting at first, because for most of your life, you believe you were becoming someone, becoming more stable, becoming more aware, becoming more complete. The entire journey felt like construction, like you were building a better version of yourself piece by piece. You worked on your reactions. You analyzed your patterns. You confronted your shadow. You adjusted your behavior. You refined your identity. And through all of this, there was an underlying assumption that you were moving towards something you were not yet. That wholeness was ahead of you, that your real self was something to be created. But at a certain point, something begins to shift, not through effort, not through a breakthrough, but through a quiet realization. You begin to notice that what you are experiencing does not feel like becoming someone new. It feels like something familiar, returning. You may notice this in subtle moments where you respond to a situation in a way that feels natural, not forced. Moments where you express something honestly without overthinking it. Moments where you feel grounded without needing to manage yourself. And in those moments, something becomes clear. This does not feel like improvement. It feels like alignment, as if you are no longer trying to be something, but simply allowing something to be. Consider a real-life example. Earlier in your life, you may have struggled with setting boundaries. You said yes when you meant no. You avoided conflict. You adjusted yourself to maintain connection. And when you began working on this, it felt like effort. You had to remind yourself to speak up, to assert yourself, to hold your position. It felt like learning a new behavior. But over time, something changes. You no longer have to force the boundary. You no longer rehearse it internally. You simply feel when something is not aligned, and you respond, not aggressively, not defensively, but naturally. And afterward, you do not feel like you performed something. You feel like you expressed something that was already there. This is where the shift begins, because the experience is no longer one of construction. It is one of uncovering. Another example appears in how you relate to your emotions. Earlier, emotions may have felt overwhelming or confusing. You reacted quickly. You were pulled into them. You tried to control or suppress them. And when you began developing awareness, you learned techniques, observation, regulation, reflection. Again, it felt like learning something new. But eventually, your relationship with your emotions begins to change in a different way. You feel them, but you are not consumed by them. You understand them, but you do not overanalyze them. You allow them without losing yourself in them. And this experience does not feel like something you are doing. It feels like something you are remembering, as if this way of being was always available, but covered. Carl Jung described individuation not as self-improvement, but as self-realization, a process of uncovering what already exists beneath layers of conditioning, defense, and unconscious identification. And this distinction is crucial, because it challenges one of the deepest assumptions people carry, the assumption that they are fundamentally incomplete, that they must become something in order to be whole. But what if wholeness was never absent? What if it was obscured? What if the journey was not about adding, but about removing? You may begin to sense this in how your identity feels over time. Earlier, identity may have felt constructed, defined by roles, achievements, perceptions. You identified with what you did, how others saw you, what you believed about yourself. And as you began your inner work, you started modifying that identity, letting go of certain roles, challenging certain beliefs, reframing your self-concept. Again, it felt like change, like transformation. But eventually, even this process begins to shift. You become less interested in defining yourself, less attached to labels, less concerned with maintaining a specific image, and instead, you begin to experience yourself more directly, without needing to constantly interpret who you are. And this experience feels different, because it does not rely on construction. It relies on presence. You are not trying to become something. You are simply being. And this can feel unfamiliar at first, because the mind is used operating through goals, through improvement, through movement towards something. But this stage introduces a different orientation, one where movement becomes less about becoming and more about recognizing. Carl Jung often emphasized that the self is not something that is created. It is something that is discovered. It exists as the deeper organizing center of the psyche, present from the beginning, but often obscured by the ego's identifications, defenses, and adaptations. And individuation is the process through which those layers are gradually seen, understood, and integrated, not to build something new, but to reveal what has always been there. This realization can be both relieving and unsettling. Relieving, because it removes the pressure to become perfect, to fix yourself completely, to reach some final version. But unsettling, because it challenges the narrative you've relied on for so long. The narrative that says, I will be complete when, I will be enough once, I will become who I need to be if, and now, those statements begin to lose their meaning, because you start to see that what you were searching for was never entirely absent. It was simply covered by fear, by conditioning, by unconscious patterns, by the need to adapt to environments that required you to become something specific. And as those layers begin to dissolve, something else emerges, not something new, but something more accurate. You, not the constructed version, not the adapted version, but the underlying presence that has always been there. You may notice this in quiet moments, moments where you are not performing, not analyzing, not trying to improve, just existing. And in those moments, there is a sense of completeness, not perfection, but completeness. Nothing missing, nothing to add, just clarity. And this is where the illusion of self-improvement begins to dissolve, not entirely, but significantly, because you begin to understand that growth was never about becoming someone else. It was about removing what prevented you from being yourself. Carl Jung's entire philosophy points toward this paradox, that the journey of transformation leads back to what was always present, that the process of becoming reveals that there was nothing fundamental to become, only something to remember. And this is why this stage of growth feels different from everything before it. It is quieter, less driven, less focused on outcomes, more centered on presence. You are still evolving, still learning, still integrating, but the motivation has shifted. It is no longer about reaching a future version of yourself. It is about aligning with what you already recognize within yourself. And that alignment feels like remembering, not in a literal sense, but in an experiential one, as if something deeply familiar is returning to the surface, something that was always there, waiting to be seen. A deeper layer of understanding begins when you question something that once felt unquestionable. Why did it always feel like you needed to become someone? Because for most of your life, that belief did not feel like an illusion. It felt like reality. You saw parts of yourself that were reactive, insecure, confused, contradictory, and naturally, you concluded that those parts needed to be fixed, improved, replaced. So the journey began. You started working on yourself. You learned emotional regulation. You developed self-awareness. You studied your patterns. You tried to correct your behavior. And all of this created a very powerful narrative. I am becoming better. And this narrative is not entirely false. There is real development, real growth, real change. But underneath that narrative, something more subtle is operating. An assumption that often goes unquestioned. The assumption that who you are at your core is not yet enough. And that assumption becomes the driving force behind self-improvement. Carl Jung understood that much of what we call self-improvement is actually the ego attempting to reorganize itself into a more acceptable form, not necessarily into a more authentic form, but into a form that feels safer, more controlled, more aligned with internal or external expectations. This is where the illusion becomes convincing, because the changes you make are real, but the motivation behind them is often shaped by something unconscious. You may notice this when you reflect on why you wanted to change certain aspects of yourself. For example, you may have worked on becoming less emotionally reactive. On the surface, this seems like clear growth. But if you look deeper, you may find that part of that effort was driven by discomfort with your own emotional intensity, a desire to be more acceptable, more in control. more aligned with an image of how you think you should be. And while the outcome may still be positive, the underlying motivation carries an important psychological layer. It is not just about understanding yourself. It is also about shaping yourself. And shaping often implies that something needs to be corrected. Another example appears in how people approach confidence. You may have worked on becoming more confident, more assertive, more secure. Again, this reflects real development. But if you look closely, you may notice that the effort was often directed toward eliminating feelings of insecurity, as if insecurity itself was a flaw, something that should not exist, something that needed to be removed in order to become complete. But what if insecurity was never a problem? What if it was simply a part of the psyche that needed to be understood, not eliminated? This is where Jung's perspective becomes crucial. He did not view the psyche as something to be perfected. He viewed it as something to be integrated. The goal was not to remove certain parts, but to bring them into consciousness, to understand their role, to relate to them differently. Because the moment you try to eliminate parts of yourself entirely, you create division, and division is what fragmentation is. You identify with certain aspects of yourself and reject others. You embrace what feels acceptable and push away what feels uncomfortable. And this creates an internal split. One part becomes your identity. The other becomes your shadow. Carl Jung emphasized that the shadow is not just a negative aspect of the personality. It includes everything that has been rejected, suppressed, or ignored. And often, the drive for self-improvement is fueled by an attempt to distance yourself from a shadow, to become the version of yourself that does not include those unwanted parts. But here is where the illusion begins to reveal itself, because no matter how much you try to refine yourself, those rejected parts do not disappear. They remain. They influence your behavior. They shape your reactions. They exist beneath the surface. And this is why the process of becoming better often feels endless, because it is based on an incomplete premise. The premise that you can construct a version of yourself that is free from contradiction, free from complexity, free from the aspects you do not want. But the psyche does not work that way. It is inherently complex. It contains opposites, strength and vulnerability, confidence and insecurity, clarity and confusion. And wholeness does not come from eliminating one side. It comes from integrating both. You may begin to notice a shift in how you relate to your own imperfections. Earlier, imperfections may have felt like obstacles, things to fix, things to overcome. But as awareness deepens, your perspective begins to change. You start seeing these aspects not as errors, but as signals, indicators of something within you that needs attention, understanding, integration. For example, instead of trying to eliminate anxiety, you begin to understand what it is pointing toward. Instead of trying to suppress anger, you begin to explore what it is protecting. Instead of trying to erase insecurity, you begin to see what it reveals about your internal structure. And this changes the entire orientation of growth. It is no longer about becoming a version of yourself that does not experience these things. It is about becoming someone who can relate to them consciously. Carl Jung believed that individuation requires embracing the totality of the psyche, not selecting certain parts and rejecting others, but recognizing that every aspect has a place, even the parts that feel uncomfortable, even the parts that challenge your self-image. This is why the illusion of self-improvement eventually begins to dissolve, because you start to see that the goal was never to construct a flawless identity. It was to dissolve the divisions within yourself. And when those divisions begin to soften, something changes. You feel less pressure to become, less urgency to fix, less need to constantly improve, not because you stop growing, but because growth is no longer driven by rejection. It is driven by understanding. You may notice that your internal dialogue becomes less critical, less focused on what is wrong, more focused on what is true. You stop asking, "How do I become better?" and start asking, "What is actually happening within me?" This shift is subtle, but profound, because it moves you out of the mindset of construction and into the process of recognition. And recognition does not require you to become something else. It requires you to see what is already present, clearly, honestly, without distortion. Carl Jung's idea of the self points directly to this. The self is not an ideal to achieve. It is a reality to realize. It exists as the deeper structure of your psyche, but it is often obscured by the ego's attempts to control, define, and perfect itself. And individuation is the gradual process of seeing through those attempts, not rejecting them, but understanding them, seeing how the ego tries to create stability through identity, through control, through improvement, and recognizing that beneath those efforts, something more stable already exists, something that does not need to be constructed, only uncovered. This is why the illusion of self-improvement feels so convincing, because it is not entirely false. It contains truth, but it is incomplete. It focuses on changing the surface, without always addressing the underlying structure. And once you begin to see that structure, your relationship with growth changes. You are no longer trying to become someone new. You are trying to see more clearly, to remove distortion, to allow what is already there to emerge without interference. And this is where the journey begins to feel different, less like a project, more like a process of remembering, not remembering facts, but remembering yourself, beneath the roles, beneath the adaptations, beneath the layers that were added over time. And as those layers become visible, something becomes undeniable. You were never entirely missing. You were partially hidden. And the work was never about creating yourself. It was about uncovering what had always been there. A profound shift takes place when the need to become begins to lose its urgency. Not because you have achieved everything. Not because you have resolved every internal conflict. But because something deeper has become clear. The search itself was based on a misunderstanding. For a long time, movement defined your growth. You were always moving towards something. A better version of yourself. A more stable identity. A more integrated state. And that movement gave your journey direction. It gave it meaning. It created the sense that you were progressing. But eventually, something begins to feel different. The movement slows. Not externally, but internally. You may still be learning, still reflecting, still evolving. But the feeling of chasing something begins to dissolve. And in its place, something quieter appears. Recognition. You begin to notice that in certain moments, you are not trying to become anything. You are simply present. And in that presence, there is no sense of lack, no sense of needing to adjust yourself, no sense of striving, just a quiet completeness, not perfection, but completeness. And this experience can feel unfamiliar because it does not align with the mindset you have operated from for so long, the mindset of improvement, of progress, of becoming. But now, something else is emerging. A sense that what you were seeking was not ahead of you, but beneath the layers you were carrying. Consider a real-life example. You are in a situation that would have previously triggered overthinking, perhaps a social interaction where you would normally analyze your words afterward, question how you were perceived, replay the conversation, look for mistakes. Earlier, this pattern felt automatic, and when you began working on it, you tried to correct it. You told yourself to think differently, to be more confident, to let go. But now, something has changed. You leave the interaction, and there is no replay, no analysis, no internal correction. Not because you force yourself to stop, but because the impulse is not there in the same way. And in that moment, something becomes clear. You did not fix the pattern. You move beyond the need for it, not by constructing a new identity, but by no longer identifying with the old one. This is where the shift from becoming to remembering becomes undeniable, because what you are experiencing does not feel like something you created. It feels like something that was uncovered. Another example appears in how you relate to uncertainty. Earlier, uncertainty may have felt uncomfortable. You wanted clarity, control, direction, and much of your effort was directed toward creating that sense of certainty through planning, through understanding, through defining yourself. But now, your relationship with uncertainty begins to change. You still prefer clarity, but you are no longer destabilized by its absence. You can exist in not knowing, without immediately trying to resolve it. And this capacity does not feel like something you built. It feels like something you return to, as if this openness was always possible. But previously obscured by the need for control. Carl Jung's concept of the self becomes particularly relevant here. The self is not something that develops over time in the way the ego does. It is not constructed through experience. It exists as a deeper organizing principle from the beginning, but the ego, in its attempt to create stability, often builds layers around it: identifications, beliefs, defenses, roles. And these layers create a sense of identity, but they also create distortion, because they are not the full picture. They are adaptations. And individuation is a process through which these adaptations are gradually recognized for what they are, not removed entirely, but seen clearly, so that they no longer define the entirety of who you believe yourself to be. This is why the experience at this stage feels like remembering, because as those layers become more transparent, something else becomes visible, not something new, but something more fundamental. You may begin to notice that your sense of self becomes less dependent on external validation, not because you decided to stop caring, but because your internal reference point has shifted. You no longer need as much confirmation from outside, because you're more connected to what you experience inside. And that connection feels stable, not rigid, but grounded. You trust your perception more, your intuition more, your internal sense of alignment more. And this trust does not feel like confidence in the traditional sense. It feels quieter, less performative, more natural, as if you are no longer trying to prove yourself, even to yourself. This is where identity begins to feel less constructed, less maintained, less defended. You are still aware of who you are, but you are not constantly reinforcing it. You are not protecting it in the same way, because it no longer feels fragile. It feels inherent. And this changes how you move through the world. You become less reactive to how others perceive you, less affected by external judgments, not because you are indifferent, but because your sense of self is not built on those perceptions anymore. And this creates a kind of internal freedom, but also a kind of stillness, because a drive to constantly adjust, improve, and redefine yourself begins to quiet. Carl Jung described this stage as a movement toward wholeness, not a perfect state, but a more integrated one, where the ego is no longer trying to dominate or construct identity, but is instead in relationship with the self, aligned with it, responsive to it. And this alignment changes the entire nature of growth. It becomes less about effort and more about awareness, less about forcing change and more about allowing clarity. You still evolve, still encounter challenges, still discover new layers of yourself. But the orientation has shifted. You are no longer trying to become someone else. You are becoming more deeply what you already are. And that process feels different because it is not driven by lack. It is guided by recognition. You may notice that your relationship with your past also changes. Earlier, you may have seen your past as something to overcome, something to move beyond. But now, you begin to see it as part of your unfolding. Not as something separate from who you are, but as something that contributed to your current awareness. Even the parts that felt like mistakes, even the parts that created pain, they begin to feel integrated, not justified, but understood. And this understanding creates a sense of continuity, a sense that your life is not a series of disconnected versions, but a process of revealing, where each stage uncovered something new, something that was always there, but not yet visible. This is why the final illusion of self-improvement dissolves at this stage, because you see that there was never a completely separate version of yourself waiting to be built. There was only a clearer version waiting to be seen. And seeing it does not require construction. It requires honesty, presence, and the willingness to stop searching long enough to recognize what is already here. This is the paradox at the heart of individuation, that the journey of becoming leads to the realization that you were never truly becoming anything. You were remembering, not in a literal sense, but in an experiential one, returning to something that was always present beneath the layers. And once that realization stabilizes, something profound happens. The search softens, not because life is complete, but because you are no longer looking for yourself in places where you were never lost. At some point in this journey, the question quietly changes. It is no longer, who am I trying to become? It becomes, what has been here all along that I am finally seeing? And this shift is not dramatic. It does not arrive as a breakthrough. It does not feel like a final answer. It feels simple, almost too simple, which is why it is often overlooked. Because the mind has been trained to expect growth to feel like effort, like movement, like progress towards something new. But what you begin to realize is that the deepest form of growth does not feel like movement at all. It feels like stillness, not the absence of change, but the absence of striving. You are still evolving, still learning, still encountering new layers of yourself. But the urgency to become something else begins to dissolve, and in its place, something more stable appears. Recognition. You begin to see yourself more clearly, not as an idea, not as a concept, but as an experience. Direct, immediate, unconstructed, and this clarity changes how you relate to everything else. Carl Jung described individuation as the process of becoming who you truly are. But what becomes evident at this stage is that becoming was never about creating that self. It was about removing everything that prevented you from recognizing it. The roles you adopted, the expectations you internalized, the defenses you developed, the identities you constructed to navigate different environments. None of these were mistakes. They were necessary adaptations, but they were not the whole. And as they begin to loosen, something else becomes visible. Not something new, but something more fundamental. You, without the same level of distortion, without the same need to define yourself constantly, without the same pressure to improve in order to feel complete. And this is where a different kind of peace begins to emerge. Not a permanent state of calm, but a deeper sense of grounding. You are no longer searching for yourself in the same way. You are relating to yourself. You are listening, observing, responding, and this relationship becomes more stable over time. You may notice that your need for external validation continues to decrease, not because you reject it, but because it is no longer the foundation of your identity. You can receive feedback, appreciation, even criticism, without it destabilizing your sense of self, because that sense of self is no longer built on those inputs. It is grounded in something more direct, your own awareness, your own experience, your own recognition. And this changes how you move through the world. You become less reactive, less driven by comparison, less concerned with how you measure against others, because the entire framework of measurement begins to feel less relevant. You are not trying to be better than anyone. You are not even trying to be better than who you were. You are simply aligning more consistently with what you already see, and that alignment becomes your orientation. Carl Jung emphasized that the self is not an ideal to reach. It is a reality to live in relationship with, and this relationship is ongoing. It does not end. There is no final version of you that you arrive at. There is only increasing clarity, increasing alignment, increasing honesty, and this is what gives a journey its depth, because it is not about finishing. It is about continuing without distortion. You may still encounter moments of confusion, moments of reactivity, moments where old patterns reappear. But your relationship with those moments has changed. You no longer interpret them as failure. You see them as part of the process, part of the ongoing unfolding of your psyche. And because of that, you return to awareness more quickly, more naturally, without the same level of resistance. This is where humility stabilizes, not as something you try to practice, but as something that emerges naturally, because the more clearly you see yourself, the more you recognize the complexity of your own psyche, the more you understand that there is always more to uncover, more to integrate, more to recognize. And this keeps you grounded, not in a limiting way, but in a real way. You are no longer trying to reach a final state of perfection. You are participating in a continuous process of recognition, and that participation becomes your way of being. Before we close, consider this carefully. Looking back at your own journey, do you feel like you truly became someone new? Or does it feel more like you removed layers that were never fully you? When you are at your most grounded, does it feel like effort? Or does it feel like something natural, something familiar? Take a moment to reflect on that, because the answer to that question reveals something important. It reveals whether your growth has been driven by construction or guided by recognition. And if you look closely, you may begin to see that what you've been searching for has been present in quiet moments all along, not as a finished identity, but as a steady presence beneath everything else. If this resonated with you, share your reflection in the comments, not as a conclusion, but as a recognition of where you are right now. Because someone else, still caught in the effort of becoming, may read your words and begin to question whether they have been searching in the wrong direction. And that question alone can change everything. Because in the end, the journey was never about becoming someone else. It was about seeing clearly enough to realize you were never missing.